Today we'll be covering the period from 1230 AD to 1520 AD. The main thing that happened in Asia is gunpowder continued to be developed. Early gunpowder, one of the earliest gunpowder weapons in Asia was something called the fire arrow. It started out as an arrow with a little bag of gunpowder tied to it that would detonate either on impact or when the fuse on the little bag ran out. Eventually, and this was back in the early 1000 AD era, gunpowder rockets began to be attached to arrows to essentially increase their flight range. So these could be released from a bow, and then the rocket would carry it to significantly longer flight, and then there'd be a small explosive bit of gunpowder at the back. By 1230, you have the evolution of fire arrows into essentially the exact same thing, but significantly larger. So these would have been the first sort of artillery-grade rockets, and they essentially were boosted up fire arrows, but now because you have a much larger amount of gunpowder, you can both send it farther and put a larger charge on it for the ammunition. The first time that these are believed to have been used was at the Mongol siege of Kaifeng, when the defenders of Kaifeng attempted to use very heavy rockets against the Mongols. The description of these is that these were fire arrows whose explosion you could hear for 5 li, or around 2.5 kilometers. So some significant amount of gunpowder was carried as the warhead. And ironically, some of these rockets were captured by the Mongols and then used against people further down in the west in just 10 years after this. And in fact, these were used against the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohi in 1241. So one of the things that we noticed about the Mongol Empire is that they didn't really do a lot of their own inventing, but they did do a lot of taking everybody's inventions and then using them against everybody else. So when they invaded the Chinese, they got cannons and rockets. When they invaded the Europeans, they got various catapults, and then they just used everything that they had against everybody all over the place. So in this case, in the Battle of Mohi, they used something that might have probably been fire arrows, but some of the descriptions indicate significantly larger explosions that you would expect from just an arrow fired from a bow. So it is possible that they used some of these heavier rockets. Also, incidentally, the Battle of Mohi was fought within just a few days from another battle which was fought in Poland. And the Mongol strategist Subadai, he essentially planned out 2 battles over 500 miles apart and won both of them. So they had pretty good tacticians on their side, in addition to the technology that they brought from everyone. Also with the Chinese, you get the first use of naval rocketry, which was first mentioned during the Song Dynasty around 1245. These were essentially the exact same concept. You have a much larger arrow with a much larger gunpowder charge, which is released from a much heavier crossbow. But the concept is once again the same. It's just that now, because you're on a ship, you can afford a significantly heavier bow, you can afford a significantly heavier charge, and then that charge is significantly more useful against a ship than just something you fire from a bow and arrow, because ships are usually made significantly more sturdy than people. Also, with the Chinese right around this time, we have the appearance of landmines. The first landmines were developed in 1227, also deployed against invading Mongols. The very first ones were essentially just hollow ceramic pots filled with gunpowder. There are records of something called enormous bombs that would have been detonated against a large number of invading enemies that were supposedly invented by Lu Qiangxia, but unfortunately their description ends by calling them enormous bombs, so we don't really know how big they were or how much gunpowder they would have carried. Also, smaller mines were essentially used as caltrops, where they would be spread over an area, and then when invading cavalry would come in, they would be detonated, and then the cavalry would hopefully be drawn back because they don't want to blow up their horses, because horses are expensive. Well, I guess people are too. More importantly, we have the continued development of cannons. So the first hand cannons appeared in China back around 1100, late 1100s, early 1200s. The oldest surviving hand cannon is seen here is the Heiliongjian bronze cannon. The other one that we saw in the previous lecture was actually a full-size cannon, more intended for artillery fire. This one was intended for use in hand. So it's just 34 centimeters in length and just 3.5 kilograms in weight. The caliber on this is 26 millimeters, and the powder chamber in the back is 66 millimeters. So this is to make sure that, first of all, you have a large cavity where you can put in a lot of gunpowder, so that your projectile goes with more force, but also to make sure that the walls around the gunpowder chamber are thicker. That way the iron, which at the time was very poor in quality, or the bronze, which is not particularly strong compared to iron, would not burst, but you'll be able to have all of the force of the gunpowder go into projecting your projectile rather than blowing your cannon up in your face. Also in the back over here you see a little bit of an expansion. This would go into the back of a fairly large piece of wood, essentially a spear that you would hold underarm, and then at the end of it you would have this hand cannon, so you were not actually holding the cannon in your hands while you were firing. You have the improvement of heavier cannons. This is the U2 Temple bronze cannon from 1332, and it's in caliber 105 millimeters. You see that the barrel is pretty much uniformly cylindrical. We don't see the gigantic bulbous shape on the base anymore, and this is because metallurgy by this point was already improving to a point where you did not need to have a very, very thick metal chamber. The metal itself was already strong enough to be thinner, therefore the cannon was lighter and more mobile, so you could put it onto a wheeled cart and get it from place A to point B with significantly greater ease, but still be able to release the same amount of firepower as earlier. Right around the 1200s, we see the appearance of gunpowder in Europe. So the earliest records for gunpowder formulas or gunpowder studies in general were done by Roger Bacon in 1216. It's possible that he acquired this information through the Mongols, because a large number of European scholars were allowed to have some interaction with the Mongols once the Mongols stopped trying to invade Europe, and there was a lot of intellectual exchange that happened between these and the West by means of the Mongol Empire connecting both of them. So it's possible that he acquired the first information because of Mongol connections, and by 1248 he already has a bit of a discussion on the potential military uses of gunpowder rather than just treating it as a scientific oddity as it was initially treated in Europe. The first use of cannons in Europe happened right around the time that he wrote his second treatise in 1248 at the Siege of Seville. In this case, this was part of the Reconquista, so when the Spanish were beginning to take back the Spanish peninsula from the Moors, who had invaded it in the previous century. And in this case, Spanish troops from Andalusia used captured Moorish cannons against the Moors at the city of Seville under King Ferdinand III of Castile. So in this case, the cannons were technically not made in Europe, but they were still used by the Europeans. So after they captured these cannons and used them, they would have seen what you can do with them, and you would have started to see the development of Europe's own cannons for the first time as well. The first possible mention of hand cannons in Europe comes fairly quickly after this. Some records in Spanish annals of from 1281 mention gun bearers, and these were described as serving alongside crossbowmen. So it would seem to be reasonable that these people were armed with small cannons that they would carry in hand, rather than the giant cannons that you would need an entire cart to carry. However, because the only thing that is mentioned about them is just their name, and their equipment is not mentioned, their numbers aren't really mentioned either, we don't really have too terribly much information as to what these people would have been actually armed with. Early European cannon, once the Europeans started making their own devices, the first one was called the pot de fer, or the pot of iron. And the earliest one of these is known from a manuscript from 1326. In this case, we see that there is a very thick bulbous chamber. So once again, because metallurgy was very primitive, you needed to have very, very thick walls on the chamber where you explode your gunpowder to make sure that as your projectile is fired, your cannon stays in one piece. This is a modern reproduction of a pot de fer from the Museum of Artillery in Britain, where you see the approximate, that they took the manuscript and basically followed the exact same shape. It's likely that the shape in the manuscript is somewhat exaggerated, so the full cannon would have been significantly straighter and less thick, but it carries the point across that you have the first attempts at using, making your own firepower in Europe, and then hopefully trying to use it against for the most part, each other. The ammunition from the painting appears to be a large spear, and there were some studies done, but it seems that most of the time when you try to shoot something that's tipped with a wooden spear, the spear just breaks upon being shot. So it's possible that the illustration there was more of an artistic license, but in reality this cannon would have just fired a conventional little either stone or iron ball. Very soon after this, we have the first use of cannons at sea at the Battle of Arnemunden. In this case, the English flagship called the Christopher carried 3 cannons into battle. Apparently they were not very effective because the English lost that battle and every single one of their ships was boarded. But it's the first time that cannons were at least thought to be mounted onto a ship and not just carried on land with an army on a giant cart. By 1346, we have the first usage of cannons on the battlefield at the Battle of Crécy. This was part of the 100 Years' War. And in this case, the English army brought 5 guns called Rebaldicans, which were essentially, it's a subtype of the volley gun, where you have a whole bunch of barrels on a single cart. So you can load all of these at once, and then depending on how you operate it, you can either fire from all of the barrels in one go, or you can fire the barrels individually as you need. So in this particular case, the 5 Rebaldican probably didn't do a terribly big difference to the battle, considering that more than 10,000 people were involved. But we still see that the first time that the Europeans are trying to bring cannons out into the battlefield and not just using them either to take a city that is under siege or defend a city that is being besieged. Also at the Battle of Crécy, we see the first major deployment of the longbow. This was a very long British bow that was almost 2 meters in length. And what it did was it had significantly bigger range and power than earlier bows. And in some cases, it was even enough power to penetrate through chainmail armor that some knights would have been wearing. And what it resulted in is it gave an advantage for the infantry that the infantry did not have over cavalry for quite a long time. Because during the early Middle Ages, the dominant force on the battlefield was the armored knight, who had a full suit of armor on his body, a suit of armor on his horse, and an infantryman who would, for the most part, be armed with a spear or a pitchfork, would not really be able to do very much against him. But once you start developing significantly better weapons like longbows or cannons, all of a sudden knights are no longer quite as impenetrable and no longer quite as immune against the infantry. So we see the beginning of something that eventually gets called the Infantry Revolution, where the knights of the Middle Ages become relegated to secondary importance, and the battlefield is once again ruled by infantry in very, very large mass formations. We see the improvements of siege bombardment. At the Siege of Calais in 1347, the Europeans first used naval artillery to bombard targets on shore, and also the first time that they used large caliber bombards to bombard a city from land. We'll cover the design of a bombard in a few slides. Right around the 1200s, we see major developments in European shipbuilding. We see the development particularly of the cog. This was developed from the Norse Nar, which was a wider and thicker version of the longship, which was used for trading operations. The major innovation that was added to the cog was the stern rudder. So earlier, the longships were double-sided, so that means that the front and the back side of the ship were identical to each other, and the way that you steered was you had 2 rudders coming off the sides, both in the back and in the front as necessary, or that could be carried from the back to the front. But the disadvantage to that is, as ships began to just use a single side rudder, when it was turning very sharply, the side rudder could actually be cleared out of the water and would not be very effective. Also, it took a lot of power to control the rudder because most of that was controlled by hand. So the introduction of a stern rudder, which could be controlled by a lever and was going as far back, or as far down into the water as the bottom of the ship, meant that your ship was much more controllable no matter the kind of sea condition, no matter the amount of force that you might be trying to fight. So all of a sudden, you have better ships being in terms of maneuverability, but also it means that you're losing the ability to have your ship be double-ended. So from here on, the double-ended ships that dominated Northern European waters for pretty much as far back as time goes were no longer a primary sort of ship that you would see. Eventually, as cogs became more and more widely used for trade, some of them were built with defensive castles. This was done both on trading cogs, so that they could defend themselves against pirates, and on military cogs, so that they had platforms for their archers and various other soldiers to fight against people on other ships. And while the Northern Europeans were developing the cog, the Mediterranean shipbuilders developed a new type of galley called the Zenzile galley around 1300. So earlier galleys that the Greeks and the Romans used, they usually had one rower per deck and operating a relatively short oar, and that meant that their rowers were fairly comfortably seated, but the galley itself was fairly tall and was not very stable because it was somewhat top-heavy. With the Zenzile galley, what you do is you still have 3 rows of oars, but now all of the rowers are on the exact same deck, and they're just staggered in echelon. So that means that the one closest to the side of the ship is sitting at some position, the one next to him is sitting forward and to the left, and the one sitting beyond that is again sitting forward and to the left. And what that meant is that all of a sudden you have all of your rowers on the exact same level, so your galley can be lower and more stable in the water. And if you pivot the oars against the outriggers, then all of the rowers can basically work with the exact same length of oar, no matter from which position they are working with. The unfortunate part is that now, in order to row, the rowers had to stand up and then essentially throw themselves back down onto their seat for each time that you did a stroke. So the rowing itself was more difficult, but it was really intended for times when you did not have a friendly wind or when you were going into battle. So most of the time on a galley, it would be operated under a sail, and you really only used rowers when you really had to go either against the wind or into battle, or just maneuver inside a port to get in and out. So the major advantage, the other major advantage is that it now allowed a galley to become more wide, so there was more cargo space to carry either goods or soldiers, or during the late Middle Ages, pilgrims. One of the major uses for galleys around the 1300s and the 1400s was carrying pilgrims from Europe to the Holy Land, while part of the Holy Land was under control of the European Crusaders. And that led to a fairly large amount of development in galley building, because people who operated these wanted to get more money for their worth. So they built increasingly larger galleys so they could take more goods or more pilgrims at the same time. And that economic advantage essentially meant that galleys grew to larger and larger and larger sizes. For the military, the Zenzile galley had an updated set of armaments as well. The underwater ram, which was very prominent and common on Greek and Roman galleys, had disappeared by the time that the Byzantines were making their drawings. So with the medieval galleys, they also did not return to the underwater ram. Instead, they had a raised pointed beak, which you see right in the front here, and that would essentially be used as a boarding bridge. So if you had soldiers or marines on board your galley, you would try to get that beak over another galley, and then they would just charge off and then board the other ship and try to take control of it by boarding. Also, following through with the advances that the late Greeks and the Romans had, there were catapults, and typically these catapults were mounted in forward positions so that as the galley was moving towards a target, it could consistently lay down firepower before it hit with the bridge, and then the galley that is the target would hopefully already be weakened and could be taken more easily by the boarders. So with the Middle Ages, once again, the dominant power early on were the knights, specifically the wealthy nobles. So every single knight was a noble in his own right. He was rich enough to own his own horse, to buy his own armor, to spend time training for war, rather than working with the field and trying to grow food for his family. So these had basically absolutely nobody who could take them on from the lower ranks, because the lower ranks were people who were spending most of their time working on their farm fields or working with their horses or their cows. So they did not know how to fight, they did not have any money for equipment, they did not have any money for armor, they didn't really have money for battle horses either, so the knights were the king of the battlefield. But in the 1300s, in Europe, something called the Infantry Revolution began, which I mentioned very briefly. The first engagement, which is associated with the Infantry Revolution, was the Battle of the Golden Spurs, which was a battle of the Flemish fighting against the French. And in this case, this was the first instance when a mass amount of cheap infantry militia was able to defeat a well-trained army of noble mounted knights. The primary reason for this defeat is that the Flemish militia were very well trained in terms of holding their own as a formation against the cavalry, and they learned that if you have a very large row of pikes, then it's very difficult for horses to get through that, because horses are not stupid and they don't like to get stabbed. So by choosing a terrain which was very difficult for horses in the first place, and holding their ground until they essentially forced the French off the battlefield or surrounded and killed them, they were able to win this battle. And with this victory, you see more and more, first rare but occasional instances of very well-trained massed infantry made out of the lower classes beginning to hold their own on the battlefield. And over the next 100 years, the most famous one was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. In this case, the English infantry, which was predominantly made up of longbowmen, was able to defeat very heavily armored French knights. And once again, you have a very cheap infantry formation where most of the soldiers don't really have any expensive armor, they don't have expensive horses, they just have a fairly cheap or comparably cheap longbow, and just covering the knights that are coming at them in volleys and volleys of arrow fire. And so the primary advantage of having an infantry force like this is that it's much cheaper. So the early Middle Ages, the logic that kings and queens had was that if I want to be able to win wars, I have to invest all of this money in supporting all of my knights, I have to invest money in terms of making sure that they have enough of their own resources to buy their own horses, to get their own armor, get their own shields, and so on and so forth. So once people realize that mass infantry can be as effective, but it's way, way cheaper, kings and queens were a lot more interested in funding this sort of army, because you could have 10 times as many people who don't really need that much payment, or at least you don't have to give them that much payment because they don't know that they can be paid that much. And all of a sudden you can be taking over your enemy at just a fraction of the cost, and considering that it's all just a battle for resources, everybody's happy. So, in addition to the infantry revolution, there was one more thing that was changing the face of Europe in general, and that was a couple of decades of very, very bad famines and plagues, which really happened all over the world. This all started with the Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317. Before this famine, Europe's population was, on average, growing fairly reliably since around 1050 AD. Because the kingdoms and dukedoms that were established were more or less stable. Sure, they fought each other, but there were no acts of mass genocide, there were no acts of mass extinction. Now, there were famines over the place here and there, but these were more local events. However, in 1315, there was a summer with very, very heavy rain, and most of the crops throughout Europe failed. People had some amount of support because they had grain that they were planning to save for next year for seeding. So in 1315, the famine was severe, but it wasn't lethal. In 1316, the rains continued. So the grains that people sowed in hopes that they would become new food were also failed. So they had still a little bit of grain left over. That was then completely destroyed because in 1317, the heavy rains still continued, and most of the crops failed again. So throughout Europe, during these 3 years, we see an estimated loss of 10 to 25% of the population being killed. And in addition to the loss of population just to starvation, you had mass amounts of things like cannibalism. It's believed that the story of Hansel and Gretel and the wicked witch that tries to eat them is probably dated, or probably originated during the Great Famine, because it was not uncommon for, first of all, people to leave their children in the forest because they couldn't support for them, and for people to attempt to eat each other because you're hungry and you're no longer able to think straight. And even after the famines ended, and in 1318 you finally had the first somewhat decent crop growths, the food supply and population didn't really stabilize until as late as 1322 to 1325, depending on the specific nation. And as one might imagine, where you have a famine, epidemics are very closely following. So around the time of the Great Famine, there were a large number of local epidemics of smallpox and various other diseases flaring up all throughout Europe. And if you think this is setting the stage for something, then you're absolutely correct. Because right around a few decades later, the bubonic plague appears. The first instance of the plague, which is believed to have been that same specific infection, was in China, and it followed a major famine in 1331, which was very soon followed by a major plague. And it's believed, based on the descriptions, that this would have been the exact same disease. So it would have been spread through, once again, the Mongol trading networks. A second major plague outbreak ravaged through China once again in 1334. In 1338, there's a flare-up that was reported in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, incidentally where I'm from, right around Lake Issyk-Kul. And we see continued spread of plague into closer and closer to Europe through the Mongol Empire until it finally reached there in the late 1340s. The estimated death toll in Asia from these particular plague outbreaks is around 25 million. And once it hit Europe in 1346, it really had a field day there, because Europe. It's believed that the plague was first brought to Europe by the Mongols, who were besieging the city of Kaffa. This would have been right over here on the Crimean Peninsula. And they used infected corpses of their own soldiers as ammunition that were then thrown into the city, because the Mongols had no ideas or no concepts of honorable warfare. And they did this fairly frequently. And in Kaffa at the time, there were a lot of traders from Genoa who attempted to flee. And as they fled from Kaffa, they took all of these infected rats and probably their own infected selves, and ended up spreading that disease throughout all of their trade networks, which eventually spread throughout the rest of Europe. Considering that Europe was very closely interrelated by trade networks all throughout, the spread was pretty much within just a few years for the first, second, and other major outbreaks. It's believed that overall the plague led to the deaths of around 75 to 200 million people over these 7 years. That would have indicated a loss of 30 to 60% of Europe's total population, with greater losses in cities because of the greater proximity, but also fairly significant losses for people out in the countryside because they still have to interact with people at some point in general. And population levels in Europe didn't really recover for the next 200 years. So all of a sudden, you're looking at losing a full third of your population at best. You're going to have a little bit of social reorganization because all of a sudden there's just fewer people to do the same amount of things to do. So the bubonic plague is considered as one of the essentially triggers for what eventually became the Renaissance, because all of a sudden the social order that was present throughout the Middle Ages was destroyed because half the people responsible for that social order were no longer a thing. So we get back to somewhat more happy thoughts with some shipbuilding. Towards the end of the bubonic plague, we see the evolution of a new type of ship called the carrack. So, as a reference, Northern European and Southern European shipbuilding had first met in the Mediterranean as people began to trade across various parts of Europe. And in this exchange of technical information, we had the northern ships, which were usually carrying a single square sail and clinker built, so that means that they had planks that overlapped over each other, fixed together with iron nails, and generally built very sturdily and very powerfully. And they met the southern ships. These usually carry 2 or sometimes 3 lateen sails. These were triangular sails, which are significantly better for various maneuvering and sailing into unfriendly winds. And these ships were built much lighter and weaker because they were built with something called a mortise and tenon, where you essentially form your pieces of wood so that they fit together like Lego bricks, and therefore you use less wood because you don't have that much overlap between the pieces of wood. And for the Mediterranean, mortise and tenon was perfect because the waters in the Mediterranean are more or less peaceful, whereas in the Northern Sea, the clinker construction was required because the waters themselves are significantly more difficult to navigate, and there are more storms, and it's, in general, a less happy place for your ship. So, out of the marriage of these two types of ships, we see some improvements that the Mediterranean shipbuilders had on the northern cod. They added a mast in the stem, in the back over here, called the mizzen mast. And this mast initially carried just a lateen sail, mostly for maneuverability. They improved on the forecastle and aftercastle by making them build more smoothly to the ship instead of just sticking out like a giant box. They made it more pretty because they had more money to actually invest in shipbuilding, because being traders, when you trade thousands of tons of silk and spices every single year, you can make your ships prettier, because then hopefully people will be more attracted to your ships and not to the ships of the other guy who looks like a cheese box on a raft. So we also see the addition of a foremast. So this is in front of the ship, and then carried the head sail that basically made the ship more controllable in friendly winds. And finally, the sides of these new ships were built cargo built, which means that it's sort of like a clinker built ship, except the planks no longer overlap with each other, but you still affix them to a strong skeleton structure instead of doing a mortise and tenon. So it's a nice little balance between Northern and European shipbuilding, and it led to ships which were themselves lighter for their size, but they were also stronger, so you could build them to significantly greater proportions. The sides were built up, so with earlier ships, we used to see that in the middle it would be significantly lower, and you just have a forecastle and an aftercastle, but now you're building up the sides as well to improve their seaworthiness. We add a small bowsprit sail up on the front. This then became the new head sail to be able to improve controllability, and in addition to all of this, we just see a general increase in bulk and the number of sails in general. So the mainmast now would carry 2 sails instead of just 1, and sometimes the foremast would carry a small sail up on the top as well. So this is essentially how you get from the cog and the galley to the carrack. Essentially just a nice little marriage of the two concepts into one. The first carracks appear in the late 1300s. The first record is in 1359, where a carrack is reported as captured by some Venetian galleys. But after around 1400, carracks begin to be the dominant type of ship that's used for both trade and war throughout most of Northern Europe and much of Southern Europe as well. Getting back to the Far East Asian theater for a little bit, we see the writing of the Huolongjing. This was another major Chinese military encyclopedia, sort of following on the Wujing Zhongyao, which was covered in the last lecture from 1054. This one was compiled in 1370, written by Jiao Yu and Liu Ji, or Liu Bowen, that's Liu Bowen in the picture, from the Ming Dynasty. And one of the things that the Huolongjing improved upon is the gunpowder formulae. So these were now focused on doing better explosiveness and also poisonous gunpowder mixtures. But the main beauty behind the Huolongjing is not its gunpowder mixtures. Those were more of an aside. It's more what the gunpowder was used for. And what was it used for? Well, you have new and improved types of fire arrows. Going off from earlier, we remember that there were some fire arrows with just explosive heads on them, some that were rocket propelled. But with the Huolongjing, we see now the first real multiple rocket launchers. The Wujing Zhongyao mentioned one that had maybe 12 fire arrows. With this one, you see something that could fire upwards of 50. And with a device like this, it would presumably have been lit from a single fuse, and then that single fuse would have most likely launched these arrows one by one, but in very, very rapid succession. So essentially a much improved version of a multiple rocket launcher in 1370 China. We see the improvement of just general rockets for various purposes. We see the descriptions of rockets with wings so that they would have a basically better range per flight. So basically medieval cruise missiles, except significantly smaller in range. And of course not shaped like an actual bird, that's more just a thematic thing that they had. Also, the first known multiple stage rocket. So this one was developed for the Chinese Navy. It had essentially a single gigantic container that was carried by 4 booster rockets. Once this container was up at some altitude, the fire that was lit from the booster rockets would have lit a bunch of small rockets inside this container, and these rockets would have been fired out of the head of the Dragon. So this was used by the Chinese Navy to essentially have a long-range rocket which then fired a whole bunch of small rockets at an enemy group of ships. That gave them significantly better range, as well as just generally awesomeness factor. Because if you see a Dragon coming at you and then it starts spewing fire at you, and you're Chinese and it's 1370, you get really scared. And essentially battles are just scaring the other guy until he surrenders. So in this case, it's completely completely justified. We see the improvement of fire lances, where fire lances are made from iron, fire lances are made from various other materials. You have fire lances shooting larger and larger amounts of shrapnel, like you see in that one and in this one. You see fire arrows with multiple barrels at once, fire arrows at the ends of spears, fire arrows with a bunch of darts firing out of them, fire arrows with what is recorded to be small explosive iron shells, which is incidentally the first record of explosive iron shells used anywhere in the world. We see a very interesting design called the fire lance shield, where it's a mobile shield through which a bunch of soldiers could stick out their fire lances and move it together as one unit. Therefore, they could shoot and reload their fire lances behind the protection of the shield, and to the sides they would be protected by swordsmen so that an enemy could not just stab them from the side while they are reloading their weapons. We see the evolution of cannons being described very carefully in the Hualangjing. So we have the early low power cannons. These would have primarily been used for shock because they would have not fired very far or very powerfully. So the focus on gunpowder for these was to have more flame, more smoke, more shrapnel, sometimes to fire poison smoke at the enemy, but not really much for firepower itself. And most of these are portrayed on stationary mounts because they would have been used either while besieging a city or trying to defend yourself against a besieging army. We see the continued evolution of cannons into iron devices which were significantly more powerful. Ammunition for these was described as being able to punch through people and horses, and sometimes even several people at once. We see that the construction is not only made out of iron, but it's also reinforced with iron hooks, which ensured that the cannon would not burst at the seams when being fired. So even though it was heavier, it was significantly more safe and could fire more shots before it had to be either replaced or it would be destroyed by exploding. We see many designs of cannons on wheeled carriages, which is important because if you want to carry a cannon into a battlefield, you need to have a wheeled carriage because you're not going to be spending so much time setting up the stationary mount if you just have to move it 10 minutes down the line anyways. And we see the designs of some cannons being mentioned as having multiple barrels, so something like the Rebaldecan that we saw from Europe at the Battle of Crécy. We see some evolution of hand cannons, including this very odd design that was supposed to fire a canister that would explode with poison gunpowder. So essentially a poison grenade launcher, but once again from medieval China. And of course we have bombs, so many bombs. We have bombs with internal rockets. So this is a bomb that was described as having a lot of small rockets on the inside so that when the bomb blew up, the rockets would go in every single direction, so you essentially have a firecracker from hell. You have bombs with poison gunpowder, you have bombs with shrapnel including caltrops or just iron pellets as you see with this one. You see bombs that are rocket assisted, like this particular guy, which means that you can fire it out of a catapult, but then it would fly even farther because there's a rocket pushing it. You have bombs with high explosive gunpowder, you have bombs that you could fire at, you could launch at enemy ships, and you have explosive iron shells for use with cannons and hand cannons. And in addition to that, you have mines. The first descriptions of complicated landmine systems. Instead of just throwing a pot onto the dirt or a little bit under the ground, we have the first self-activated landmines, such as the one that's described here. The activation mechanism was described as using a pin release on weights and axles, so that when the ground above it was disturbed, and usually it would be covered by some wooden boards, the pin would release, some weights would pull on an iron or on a flint wheel, and it would produce a bunch of sparks that would light a whole bunch of gunpowder. The gunpowder would go into a bunch of mines that are underground, and the whole thing would blow up. So essentially, if a Mongol army is invading, and they come upon something like this, by the time that the mines explode, hopefully most of the army is right above the mines already, so when they blow up, you basically have several thousand Mongols no longer being Mongols. You have very large frame-based landmines where you just have a lot of gunpowder pellets in a single frame to essentially deny a small section of ground, and very convoluted designs with just very large area being denied to the enemy, where a single trigger triggers this flower shape of landmine, so probably for a few hundred square meters could be detonated in one go. And you have the first naval mines. This one particularly is a beautiful example of engineering, where you have a pre-ignited fuse at the top, which has a certain length to it. The fuse is connected to a mine that is down below, underwater. in a finely weighed box, which has rocks to weigh down, but also air inside to make sure that it floats just below the surface of the water. And the way that you would use this mine is you would light the fuse, you would launch this thing downriver, and you would just let it float to the enemy fleet, hopefully at night, so that nobody notices that there's a tiny little burning wick at the top of the water. It would get stuck against one of their ships, the fuse would run out, and the whole thing would detonate, and you would sink a few enemy ships. Or maybe just one. So, back to Europe a little bit. In Europe, we see the evolution of guns, and specifically the first gun that could be considered as the grandfather of an actual rifle, the arquebus. This was really the first long gun, rather than just a hand cannon, which was a short stubby thing on a giant wooden handle. First arquebuses appear in Germany in 1375. These were essentially a very long barrel with a wooden stock that you would be able to hold, mounted on a stick, because they were still way too heavy to actually just hold with two hands, for one, and for two, because the gunpowder had to be ignited by a handheld burning fuse that you would put into the lighting hole just like you would with a cannon. So this is the first time that we see guns that are intended completely by design for infantry use, rather than just taking a regular cannon and just scaling it down a little bit. We see the evolution of something called the bombard. This was a beautiful piece of engineering because it's the first time that you have something that's truly complicated to build. So the way that you would build a bombard is you start out with a wooden core, which is essentially just a long cylindrical piece of wood. You take the wooden core and you put a lot of just solid iron bars over this core. And these are just rectangular bars that you put in a circle. Over these bars you drive a series of hoops. And these hoops are intended to clamp together on the iron bars. And then what you do is you heat the entire construction and you hammer weld it for days and days and days on end, so that the outer hoops essentially become fused together and also fused with the iron bars below. After you complete this, you cool down the structure, and as you cool it down, the hoops get compressed over the iron bars so that the whole thing becomes even more rigid. And then once you do this, you incinerate the wooden core from the inside, and you put in a hollow cast core, which is essentially just a regular cannon. So it's essentially a cannon within a cannon within a cannon. And this would have been primarily used for firing very, very heavy ammunition that would otherwise just cause your entire cannon to blow up into pieces. There was quite a range of sizes for bombards, and the smallest ones would go around 200 kilograms for the entire structure, and they could fire 6 kilogram boulders or balls. Larger ones, such as the Mons Meg from Scotland, weighed 6.5 tons and could fire 175 kilogram balls. And then you have the super bombards, such as the Dardanelles gun or the Great Turkish Bombard, that weighed 16 tons and fired balls of 1 ton. A similar gun was used by Mehmed against Constantinople to basically break gigantic holes in the wall through which the Turkish army then just made their way. So bombards are the first sort of super artillery that you see in the world, and considering that they were super artillery, they required super complicated methods of construction. Back to Asia for a little bit, we have the voyages of Chinese Admiral Zheng He. He conducted 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433, made landfall in 30 kingdoms and empires. A typical fleet carried 27,000 men, 60 treasure junks and 190 support vessels. The treasure junks were a bit of a miracle of engineering in their own day. For reference, this is a treasure junk. This is Christopher Columbus's ship with which he sailed to the New World. These could have reached over 120 meters in length and 50 meters in beam. They had 9 masts holding 12 Chinese rectangular sails. A crew of this would be over 400 and possibly up to 1,000. Armament was 24 bronze cannon and various bombardment rockets. These were primarily used as the flagships of the fleet, so the admiral would have been upon one, and his various commanders would have been commanding the other ones. And if the mission meant somebody who was peaceful, then the treasure junks carried a large amount of treasure to establish political connections. And if they meant somebody who was not peaceful, they could be destroyed by all the bronze cannon and the rockets that the ship carried. In fact, researchers and shipbuilders from Europe didn't really believe in the descriptions of these for quite a few decades, but there were, in the late 70s and 80s and 90s, There were some shipyards where these were built were discovered, and it seems from the sizes of the rudders and the sizes of the anchors and the sizes of just the slipways, the descriptions of 120, 130 meters are actually quite reasonable. So the Chinese had significantly better shipbuilding at this particular point in history than did anybody in Europe. But unfortunately, after Zheng He had completed his voyages, the next emperor was strongly advised by his advisors to carry a more internal policy, and China essentially closed itself off from the world. The great treasure ships were burned or just left to rot, and China was left essentially closed within its own borders. In addition to the treasure junks, or the Bao Chuan, they had several other types of ships. There were the horse junks with 8 masts and 100 meters in length, supply junks of 7 masts and 80 meters, troop carrying junks with 6 masts and 65 meters, and war junks for 5 masts and 50 meters, essentially for chasing down pirates or fighting off enemies that might be trying to attack the fleet at large. And in Korea, we see some developments of their own. Initially, the Koreans were able to buy gunpowder from the Chinese, but eventually the Chinese decided that they want to close off all of their foreign contacts for buying gunpowder because it was too dangerous. So the Chinese, or the Koreans, had to develop their own gunpowder instead. And they developed a large number of similar weapons to the Chinese with a very heavy focus on rocketry. And this eventually led to something called the Hwacha, which was essentially the ancient Korean multiple rocket launcher first developed in 1409. Typically, the Hwacha was used to fire around 200 Sinjon rocket-propelled fire arrows. So this was way more than most of the Chinese multiple rocket launchers, but essentially carried the exact same concept, but with somewhat larger rockets, larger arrows, and more range for the fire. In the Navy, the Koreans initially used Chinese and Japanese types of junks, but around 1413 we have the first mention of armored warships, the Wison, being developed by the Joseon Koreans as well. It's possible that these ships used very thin iron plates on the outside to defend against incendiary arrows. These essentially were the prototypes for the more famous Göbokson, or the turtle ships that were used about 100 years or 150 years down the line. But in 1413 were the first records of just any type of armored warship. So it seems that the concept of armoring your warship was alive and well in Korea for quite a while, even up until the time of the later wars against the Japanese. Similar developments in Europe, we see ships growing to greater and greater size, but still maintaining the same carrack type of ship. The biggest example from the early 1500s was the Henri Assadieu, which was an English ship with a French name. I have no idea why. I guess Europe. It had a deck length of 50 meters, a beam of 12.5, displacement of 1,500 tons, and a complement of 700. And this thing carried 43 cannon, which were on the lower 2 decks, and were actually cannon that you would load a ball into and then fire off as an artillery piece, and 140 swivel guns, which were really just arquebuses, but mounted on swivel mounts so that you did not have the chance of a soldier accidentally dropping one into the water, because then you're just with one swivel gun less. And you have the development of a new type of ship called the caravel. Developed in Portugal around 1450, these were initially very light ships used for exploration. 2 of Christopher Columbus's 3 ships on the voyage to the New World were caravels. The other one was the Nau, which was essentially the Portuguese version of a carrack. These were better suited for difficult winds because they were rigged with 3 lateen sails, and because they were light and very maneuverable, you could take them into places where bigger ships could not go, such as shallow waters, basically difficult waters where you had a lot of rocks and you needed to navigate around various obstacles, and so on and so forth. And around 1490, once again in Portugal, we see the diversification of caravel rigging, where caravels are now being rigged with some square sails and some lateen sails. The square sail was more effective under a good wind that just pushes you forward where you want to go, but a lateen sail is better in a oblique wind, or in a wind that's going backwards to the direction where you want to go. So by adding the second type of square sail, or as Christopher Columbus did, carrying 2 sets of sails each, and then either re-rigging as a square sail or a lateen sail ship, you could take advantage of any kind of wind conditions that you saw. And on larger ships, you see the addition of an extra mast, so now all of a sudden you have 4 masts rather than just 3. And we see the development of the first firing mechanism that was more advanced than just taking a light lit fuse and holding it in your hand and putting it into a firing hole. This was the matchlock, developed in 1430. The earliest clear illustration of such a design is from Germany from 1475. Instead of having to have a person hold a lit fuse in his hand, in this case you had the lit fuse be held in a little lever, and this lever was connected to a trigger that was where you would expect the trigger to be. So when the gun was prepared to be fired, you would pour some gunpowder into this thing called a flash pan, and the gunpowder would then be lit by this lever when you would lower the trigger, so that at the moment of firing you could use both hands to hold the rifle, and you did not need to worry about wasting an entire hand just to try to light the gun. So for the most part, the serpentines were mounted forward and then bent backwards, like you see in the top example, but some examples where they bent forwards are also known from the time as well. We see the development of the first armies that made a big bet on gunpowder weaponry, and the first one was the Black Army of Hungary under King Matthias Corvinus. Founded in 1458 and operational until 1494, this was one of the very, very few full-time mercenary armies. Most of the armies of Europe at the time, even except for the ones that were just the small nobility force that kept training 24/7, most of those armies were essentially just slavey armies where you would take farmers off your field, train them for a few days, give them some spears and some swords, and then send them into battle. This army stayed as a full-time army 24/7, 7 days a week, all the time. So they were significantly more effective because they had more training, more experience, and they were the first one to use an army where every fourth soldier had his own arquebus. Contemporary armies, at best, even 50 years later, still had around only 10% armed with an arquebus, but Matthias Corvinus made his bet that gunpowder is significantly more effective than just using spears and swords. So he armed significantly a larger portion of his army with gunpowder weapons. He would have armed them with more, except unfortunately at the time, gunpowder was way too expensive, so the 25% was basically where he set the cutoff, because doing anything further would completely drain the treasury of his nation. We see the improvements of cannons in Europe as well. Around 1454, we see the first indication of cannons being mounted on a wheeled carriage. Earlier cannons were carried on carts, but they still had to be positioned into a more or less permanent location before firing, and then positioned back onto the cart for transport. But around 1454, you see the first cart wheeled carriage from which you could fire a more or less decently sized cannon. So now it means that your big firepower is significantly more mobile. Also, in 1465, we see the first development of a trunnion, which seems to be a very simple development, but it's a very powerful one. The trunnion is basically this. It's a cylindrical standoff that sticks out from the gun, which allows you to swivel the gun up and down if you want to aim it. Earlier, if you wanted to change the aim of this gun, you actually had to raise the entire thing, which would be very difficult and would require a lot of strength and force. But with this one, the trunnion is positioned right a little bit in front of the center of mass, so it's a lot easier to aim the gun upwards and downwards. It's faster to aim the gun, so therefore you have more effective firepower in every situation. And we see further developments on the sea. King John or João of Portugal pioneers the reinforced deck in 1474 on one of his square-rigged caravels. This allowed for a significantly heavier gun to be mounted on a ship that would just not break through the floor, but that would be sturdily sitting on the said floor. And in 1489, he introduced the first ever standard gunnery teams in any European navy. So these were the first crews that were given a set of instructions and training as to how to use their cannons. And he focused his efforts on broadside bombardment because at the time cannons were still very poor in accuracy. So if you wanted to make sure that you do as much damage to the enemy as possible, you would want to fire all of the cannons from the side just as quickly as possible, or perhaps even together. So if you train your crews to be good at broadsides, then they will have an advantage over another army where everyone just tries to haphazardly fire cannons at you and most of the shots miss anyways. We see the introduction of barrel rifling in 1498 in Germany. This was first used with matchlock guns, although it was very rare. And in principle, it allowed you to have better accuracy, but it significantly lengthened your reload time because the first rifle cannons, in order to engage the rifling, you had to force the round from the front. And if you have to force the round all the way from the front to the back, down the length of the barrel, you spent a lot of time and a lot of strength trying to force it down. So it was used on a few guns, but it didn't really come in to be popular until significantly later. But on those guns where it was used, because the bullet, when it leaves a rifle barrel, it has a spin, it's significantly more stable and doesn't just tumble in the sky, so therefore you have better accuracy at long range. In 1500, we see the development of the wheel lock. Wait, did I cover this? Oh, I did not. Okay. So this was the first self-igniting firearm mechanism. With the matchlock, you still needed to light a fuse and then just have it lowered. In this case, you have the sparks be generated themselves by having a spring-loaded wheel going against basically a flint piece, so that when you pushed on the trigger, you produced a bunch of sparks here. The sparks were caught by the flashbang ignited the gunpowder charge, and your gun fired. So with something like this, you didn't really have to worry about even keeping your own fuse lit, because the lighting was provided by an internal mechanism in any case. So it made the guns a lot more reliable and a lot faster to reload and use and fire. A good soldier could reload and prepare his gun for a new shot in just under a minute. And in this particular case, the additional advantage is that because most everything is actually contained on the inside, you don't need to worry about rain getting on your gunpowder inside the flashbang and then making it wet and then you failing to get ignition. You see some more developments, once again from the Portuguese in naval warfare. Around 1500, the tactic of the line of battle is first suggested from the instruction of King Manuel I, and first used by Vasco da Gama in 1502 at the Battle of Calicut. At the time, naval battles were still sort of getting out of the habit of boarding each other. So the Portuguese were the first nation that decided that they will try to solve their battles just by gunnery instead of trying to close range and board. So what they would do is they would arrange their ships in a single line and then have all of their ships bring all of their broadsides to bear, so that you have at the same time several dozens or later on several hundreds of guns all firing at the same target or at the same series of targets, rather than just haphazardly firing a few guns and then trying to close range and board. So this was sort of the birth of the real gunpowder navy that you would see later with the classic Age of Sail, that really forgot everything that there was to know about trying to board each other and just focus on massive, massive amounts of firepower. And in terms of infantry, we have the first formation specifically developed for firearms as well. This was the pipe and shot formation. It was developed by El Gran Capitan Gonzalo de Córdoba from Spain. After he was very badly defeated in a battle against the French, he decided that the Spanish army needs to have essentially reorganization. So he organized his army to have blocks of infantry armed with pikes, and these would have made a protective block in the center, and then these would have been surrounded by loose formations of arquebusiers who were armed with the arquebus firearms. These were free to move either in front or behind the pikemen, so if they needed to fire and just get a lot of rounds out at the enemy, they could move in front, but then when they needed to reload, they could withdraw behind, and the pikemen would make a defensive line protecting them against whoever is coming in at them. This was particularly effective in a defensive battle, but also effective in an offensive battle if both the pikemen and the gunnery soldiers knew what they were doing and were trained in doing it well. And the first battle where this was used, essentially by Cordoba, was the Battle of Cerignola in 1503. This was actually the first battle that was won thanks to firearms, at least in Europe. In this case, the armored French cavalry and Swiss pikemen, who were considered the best of the best in Europe, were disabled by Spanish arquebusiers, who essentially just fired volley after volley into the charging cavalry and into the charging infantry, until the French army was basically torn down, and they were unable to carry on the battle forward. And in this case, in addition to using Spanish pikemen, he also used German Landsknechts to defend the Spanish against the attacks of especially the Swiss pikemen. So this was the first battlefield use of the pike and shot formation, as well as the first use of a trench for soldiers with guns. So right before the battle, he had his soldiers dig a very large trench in which he mounted all of his arquebusiers. That way they were protected against the enemy archers because they were more difficult to hit, and they had a more stable position onto which they were to place their guns because they could rest their guns on the ground instead of having to hold them up on a stand or holding up in their hands. And to close on a somewhat sad note, but carrying on the same topic of depopulation and diseases, we have the very massive depopulation of the Western Hemisphere. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and reached the New World. And at this particular time, the population of North and South America together was estimated to have been around 55 million, although some scholars estimate 100, 140, perhaps 150 million. The high population density and good health was noticed by quite a few European explorers. Giovanni di Verrazzano wrote that he could smell the bonfires 100 miles out at sea because there were so many of them. This is a map of, or a hypothetical map of what the major language groups in the Americas might have been. There were thousands of languages in hundreds of language groups. Basically, both of these continents were completely teeming with all sorts of cultures, all sorts of nations, even some empires like the Aztec Empire, the Mayan Empire. And when the Europeans came, they brought diseases, which spread very rapidly because pretty much nobody in North or South America had any immunity to any of these. The major culprits were smallpox, influenza, the bubonic plague, yellow fever, malaria, but it was basically really anything that the Europeans were sick with that got people in the Americas also sick. Some disease, and especially early on, was spread inadvertently because Europeans would come in, they were sick, the natives would catch that disease and spread it to their families and tribes, and nobody was really at fault. But once the Europeans realized that this was happening, they caught on and started spreading disease intentionally by distributing infected blankets and infected merchandise under trade conditions. Essentially doing the same thing that the Mongols did at Kaffa and many other cities, but more maniacally so than that. And conservative estimates suggest a loss of upwards of 95% of the native population thanks to these diseases. So for instance, Haiti went from 1.5 million in 1496 to just 11,000 people by 1526. This was in part thanks to Mr. Columbus being a massive jerk, and in part to the natives having absolutely no immunity to speak of. In 1492, South America was estimated around 37 million. By 1650, even with essentially a century of recovery, their population was just at 9 million. And in 1740, a French explorer who toured the Amazon River mentioned that he saw hundreds of miles of riverbanks and thousands of villages that were now empty, but at one point were thriving. So a very large number, or probably the majority of natives who died from these diseases never even saw the Europeans in the first place. It's just that the trade networks across North and South America were very extensive, so once something disease was begun on its voyage, that disease would have spread into every corner of the two continents within just a few years. North America probably had around 18 million natives in 1492. By 1900, the native population was just 237,000. And this is an example of the population of Mexico that shows essentially the almost complete extinction of the Aztec Empire after the invasion of the Spanish. And a very interesting and somewhat disturbing way that this can be seen is in carbon dioxide concentrations. This is data from the Law Dome Antarctican ice core, and it's somewhat smoothed. So if you lose 95% of the population of two giant continents, all of a sudden all these people who used to be chopping down trees are no longer chopping down trees. And all these people who used to burn trees are no longer burning trees. So all of a sudden you have massive reforestation over both of the continents before the Europeans have the chance to spread over them. And the massive reforestation could have led to the absorption of an extra approximately 10 billion tons of CO2. And that would correspond roughly to a drop of CO2 of 10 levels, or 10 parts per million. And that is exactly what we see in Antarctic ice core. So right around 1500, Columbus discovers America. Right around 1550 to 1600, we see the largest drop in carbon dioxide levels for the past like 20,000 years in the Antarctic ice cores. And it's believed that this drop in CO2 levels might have been one of the contributions to the Little Ice Age, which was a cold snap in the 1600s, which led to even the river Thames in England being completely frozen over.